Good evening, folks. Are you ready to go to church tonight? Good. I'm glad you're here. Before we get started this evening, did everybody get a prayer list? Did everybody get a list of the teaching tonight? If you didn't, we'll go get you one. Okay. Well, on the prayer list here, we've got I've got a lot of things highlighted, and they'll be highlighted on yours. We certainly want to pray for souls to be saved on this coming Sunday, as we do for every service and every day of the week. We never want to fail to pray for that. I'm praying for Bob Pack. He is still in Riverside. They didn't move him, did they, Pastor? I don't think so. Okay. And he is going through dialysis, which really zaps his strength, takes a lot out of him. Camille Hockenberry is at James Cancer Hospital recuperating from brain surgery. Keep her in your prayers. Of course, Emmett had carotid artery surgery, or will have on the 27th. That's upcoming. And let's see, Tanya is needing prayer for her upcoming surgery on the 25th. Jonah Stone Rock is recuperating from COVID and pneumonia. And it seems like this COVID is coming back. It's not coming back with as much vengeance as it's had, but it sure is coming back a lot. And the pneumonia and horrible cold, can we get a amen over there from you, Pastor? Is coming around and just with so many people. And it's just really knocking them down for the count almost. And let's just keep those people in your prayers. Brother Floyd's back here with us, got a stent. He's running like a new watch and just doing very well. Continue to keep him in your prayers. Let's see, wasn't that a fabulous service Sunday? I think Brother Bob Burney just did a wonderful job. Appreciated him so much. Mary Fraley's daughter, baby girl Dakota, continue to keep her in your prayers. Let's see, Nora Hammond, she's home. She fell and she still needs some prayers. Baby Maverick, family of Rodney Harris, and again the viruses and everything. This upcoming service this week and Sunday, be much in prayer for that, as Tim Throckmorton. How many have heard Tim? Fantastic preacher. I think he used to be down in Circleville, and he's kind of Bob Burney's right-hand fill-in guy. Bob uses him a lot when he's not able to be on the air, and Tim filled in for him week before last when he was trying to get to Connecticut or wherever he was trying to go and didn't make it. But be much in prayer for that. Pray for the kids over there tonight. Steph and Allie aren't there. The Crabtrees aren't here, so they're a little low on help, but they have adequate help over there to get things done. But certainly keep them in your prayers. I don't know how many of you folks were here Saturday and saw the turnout for the egg hunt and the festivities. It was fantastic. I mean, we couldn't have asked for anything to be any better, and very well organized and very well participated in. And donuts. I had to go pick them up. I never picked up 45 dozen donuts in my whole life, but they will fit in my car, and part of them will fit inside of me. So also tonight, I want you to be very much in prayer for Brother Dave Jerome as he brings the teaching tonight. So let's, anybody have any prayer requests? I got one other thing I want to mention. Go ahead, Brenda. Uh-huh. Brenda, we're certainly going to keep praying for you and the situation there. Also, one more thing I want to mention before I have prayer this evening. Last evening, Sylvia called me at home, and she's had a very urgent request. There was a young man that had a car accident back on the 31st of last month, and he's in the hospital, and he was very concerned for his soul. He had, I'm just going to say it, he'd worried he committed the unpardonable sin, and there was no hope for him. And I said, well, Sylvia, I certainly tomorrow I'll go see him. So I got to thinking about that this morning, so I called Pastor Tim. I said, the young man he's been hurt pretty bad, and I said, I'm calling you for advice, or I said, this might be an avenue I've never walked down, but I said, I told Sylvia I'd go, and I will go. He said, if you come by and pick me up, I'll go with you. So we both went up there this afternoon, and the young man he was concerned for his soul. And folks, if you're concerned for your soul, you ain't committed the unpardonable sin. And so after Pastor talked with him and I said a few words, he asked the Lord into his heart. He's still got a long way to go as far as recuperation, but we told him that we would be back to see him and be praying for him. And I said, certainly, of course, the prayer list was already printed up, so he's not on here. But his name is Dalen Bariz, and his grandma was Karen Snelling, who passed away here a few years ago. And of course, we knew the family, but when, you never know, this is a small world. And that young man was, he was a whole lot happier when we left than he was when we walked in the room. So let's go to the Lord in prayer this evening. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this another opportunity to be in your house. Lord, we just ask tonight that you would be with the youth and everything that's going on the other side of the building, Lord. Just hug them all up real close and keep them in your care, and just help them to learn the things that's prepared for them over there, Lord, and be able to take it home with them and just think on these things when they go home. Lord, we ask you to be with Brother Dave as he brings the message tonight. Just use him in a mighty way. Be with each and every person in this service. Be with the prayer requests that are on this prayer list. And Lord, I hope that each and every one of us has taken a prayer list home. It's just not something that we fold up and put in our Bible, but we do open it, read it, and pray for it. Watch over us all and keep us in your care. For it's in Christ's name I ask, and amen. Brother Dave, come and minister to us.
Excuse me. Can you all hear me all right? Okay. Just sort of as a little bit of an introduction, again, as they said, I'm Dave Jerome, and I am actually a layman speaking to laymen tonight, so I should be very comfortable. Maybe I should preach at the pastor, I don't know, but anyhow, I'm a layman speaking to laymen. I am a radiographer. I worked in radiology. I have taught radiology. I worked in interventional radiology. And I graduated from Ohio State University. I have taught radiation physics at one of the Ohio State University branches. And so that's my background. And when I was in high school, I felt that the Lord was leading me to apply to go to Ohio State University, of all places. And so that's what I did. And there's a long story to that, and I will skip all of it. But when I got to Ohio State University, or when I was getting ready to go there, I prepared by taking all of all of the high school courses and everything to get in, and then I started at Ohio State University. And at Ohio State University, my goal was to go into physical therapy and then possibly go on to medical school from there. And I had to study a lot. Studying doesn't always come real easy for me, but I also had to work while I was a student at Ohio State, so I worked full-time night shift back at Doctors North, for any of you that remember when that was a hospital, and went to school full-time and studied all the time. My wife, who would like to be here, my wife is unfortunately disabled and doesn't get out anymore. About the only time she gets out is when I take her to the doctor. Other than that, she can't make it out. And she actually graduated from nurses training 2 years before I graduated from college. And so my junior year of college, we got married, and my life changed dramatically. It got a lot easier. After we were married, she was the night nurse in charge of intensive care at Doctors North, and I was the orderly at Doctors North. So I got to go from full-time nights to part-time nights after we got married, and it made my life a lot easier. I studied so much, and I was always very worried about my grade point average. And my junior year in Ohio State University, I had already taken all of my physics and math, calculus, biology, zoology, and organic chemistry, all those things to prepare that I would need to get into a medical area. And so my junior year, I was taking human anatomy and physiology. And while I was taking human anatomy and physiology, I also was told by the counselor that I had to also take a fine arts course. And when it comes to sciences, I'm fine. But art, I'm dreadful. I'm one of those kids. You know, every little boy likes to draw pictures of cars. I drew pictures of cars all the time, and you could tell they had 4 wheels, but the car looked like it had possibly been through the compactor at the junkyard and was unsuccessfully compacted. And so I was very frustrated and struggled. This is crazy, but a human anatomy where we dissected cadavers, that was a 5-hour course, and human physiology was another 5-hour course. And this course, Fine Arts, was a 3-hour course, and I found myself studying more for the 3-hour course than I did the anatomy and physiology. I really struggled with it. And the frustrating part with Fine Arts, with that course, was it wasn't like you could write a term paper. It wasn't like you could take tests along the way to help secure yourself a good grade. And here I am, so focused and worried about my grade point average. I did not want this crazy 3-hour course to ruin my grade point average and keep me from my goals. And in this fine arts course, we had to study buildings and study architects and be able to look at buildings and then tell who had built that building by the way that the building was built, the way the windows were placed, the way the doors were placed, the structure supporting it, whether it was concrete or stone that they were building it. And our grade depended on, they would flip up these slides, and you had to tell who made what building. It's sort of like right here in Columbus, there are several places built by Frank Lloyd Wright, a very famous architect, and you know as soon as you pass them that he built those. Well, besides that, we had to be able to look at paintings, and they taught us to look at the painting and tell by the canvas that it was on, tell by how thick the paint was used, tell what type of paint that was used, the way the brush strokes were put on. And people that are really particular master artists or painters are very particular about the brushes that they use. Some use very, very fine bristles, and some use medium bristles, some use heavier bristles. And the heavier the bristles, the more you can see those tiny little individual bristle lines in the paintings. And so we had to be able to look at a painting and tell who painted it, and they would just continually flip these things up on a screen, and that's how you pass. I was terrified I wasn't going to pass. And I struggled with that, and I had been a Christian since I was 8 years old. And in that situation, I knew I had to rely on the Lord. I went to the Lord, and I have a really good relationship with the Lord. I know He's omnipotent, and I know that He knows what we're thinking. So consequently, I'm the kind of person that's just likely to talk to Him and tell Him, okay, here's what's on my mind. And, that's fine. He doesn't care about that at all, as long as you're respectful. And I was telling Him, Lord, this is kind of crazy. I have no interest in this. I am not going to ever use this course. It's going to hamper me and the plans that I have for my life. And I need you to step in here. I'd like to get out of this course. But I couldn't get out of it. And so there were several scriptures that I relied on, and I've showed in those papers that you have tonight. There's some scriptures that I leaned on, not only at that time, but through my whole life. The first one is Jeremiah 29:11. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." That's tremendous, to have hope, to know that in God, the creator of the world, has a future plan for you. Proverbs 3:5 and 6. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not into your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths." That's what I needed. I really needed Him to direct my path, because it seemed like it was out of control for me. Proverbs 16:9, "A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." How often do we as laymen, and pastors too probably, we plan our lives out, we plan what we're going to do, and sometimes the Lord has to sort of rein you in a little bit and say, wait, this isn't the way you're going. I've got other plans for you. And that's what He does to us sometimes. 1 Corinthians 2:9, "Eye has not seen nor ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love Him." He's telling us here we can't even begin to imagine what He has planned for our lives long term. We see today, we don't see the future, but yet He sees. The Bible says that before we were born, He knew us. When we were in our mother's womb, He already knew us. This scripture indicates there's plans for our lives. Ephesians 2:10, it says, "For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which Christ," and notice I bolded this, it says, "which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them." God has specific plans for our lives. He knew us before we were created, yet He has specific plans for all of our lives. And I grabbed a hold of those verses and I held on to them. And I knew that God was in control, and I would just have to write it out. So then, after I finished that quarter, I took my finals in fine arts. I walked out of that class. I had literally no idea how I did. And I was like, my heart was just thumping away and thinking, oh my goodness, I hope I don't have to repeat that. And I hope it didn't mess up my grade point average. I literally didn't have a clue. The next morning, 8 o'clock, we had our anatomy and physiology final. And in our anatomy and physiology final, it was a really large room, about half the size of our sanctuary, and it was just table after table after table. And on all of those tables, there were human bones. And on each bone, there was one or two little red paper dots that were on those bones. And the professor told us that there was 120 stations. We got 20 seconds at each station. And the room is full of people all lined up at each table. And he said, I'm going to stand up here, and every 20 seconds, I'm going to, the old bells that you push down on, I'm going to push down on this bell, and you'll look at what you're supposed to see. You're going to write the answer down, and then you'll move when the bell rings to the next station. Nobody stays longer than you're supposed to because somebody is lined up right next to you at their spot. And so here's all these bones, and there's little red dots on them. It could be a groove in the bone, and you had to tell what that groove, what the name of the groove was, what purpose it served. Did a tendon run through there? Did a nerve run through there? And if there was a tuberosity or a bump on the bone, you had to tell what the name of it was and what purpose it served. And then on the other side of the room was big tables with just cadaver after cadaver after cadaver that we had already dissected. And the professors had strings on nerves and muscles and tendons, and sometimes on a little groove in a anatomical part that was making room, say, for the pancreas or something. And you had to look at that cadaver and see where the string was, and then line up the number on that string with the number on your paper and answer it in 20 seconds. You keep going. And it was very tension-filled, but I was prepared for it. And I always joke and say I'm the poster child for ADD or ADHD, whatever they want to call it now, which they had no name for any of it before. But sometimes my mind will be on two different things simultaneously. And it's just like the pastor knows. Sometimes I will be listening to his sermon, but I can tell him, oh, I saw so-and-so, and it really touched my heart or something or other. That's the way I was during this final. And as I was halfway through the final, it was like God just got a hold of me. And he said, David, you're looking at these cadavers. What do you see? And I'm going, answers to my tests? And he goes, no. Yesterday, you had your fine arts test. What did you learn in that? And I'm going, oh my goodness. I learned to be able to look and see who the master designer was, who the architect was. I was able to look and see who the master painter was. And I could distinguish. And you know, when you're a student, especially at a large university, you have a lot of professors that are focused, especially if you're in a medical area, they'll talk a lot about evolution. And in my heart, I just thought, oh, these guys really, it's okay. They don't know what they're talking about. And things look similar. And it never fazed me. I knew it wasn't true, but I accepted it blindly, which is fine. It's fine. But God used that fine arts course to help me realize, you know, previously when I took biology and zoology, I dissected worms, I dissected frogs, I dissected crayfish, we dissected pigs, we dissected cats, and now here's a human body. And you look at that, and you see all of these similarities, all these things that are identical in the circulatory system, the way it works, in the respiratory system, in the digestive system, and even the placement of muscles. And it was like a light opened up. And these scriptures really meant something to me because I saw God was showing me. He reached out to me to make very, very plain to me. He knew I enjoyed math and science and especially human anatomy and things like that. And so he was showing me, I am your creator. I am in control. I am the master designer, and I design your life. Not now only, or not when you were born, but throughout your life. He has plans that we can prosper, not financially, but spiritually. And it was amazing. And so I finished the anatomy and physiology course. I did really well. I was very thankful. And this was actually just after Easter. And when I finished my finals, shortly after that, I got a letter in the mail because I'd already applied for physical therapy. And my letter in the mail said, "We regret to inform you, you have not been selected for the physical therapy program." And again, I've already told you, I talked to God comfortably. And so I said, "God, I don't know what's going on here. I have worked for 3 years, full-time nights, gone to school, kept my GPA up, and now the door is closed. What is going on?" And I said, "I don't mean to be rude, but I almost feel like you've been on vacation." and yet he's so patient with me. And so I knew the only thing I could do was pray about it and commit it to him. And 3 days went by, and I had no idea what I was going to do. And as you can tell by my age, during this same time, it was the Vietnam War, and my draft number is 11. And so I'm figuring, oh my goodness, have I wasted 3 years of my life, and I've worked so hard? What's going on here? And after 3 days, I got a phone call from the president of the School of Allied Medicine. And I was shocked when he called me. And he goes, "Is this Dave Jerome that applied for physical therapy?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I really don't understand this." He said, "I came into my office today, and your application and all your paperwork is on my desk." He said, "I have no idea how it got here. There are no other applications, and no one seems to know how this got here." He said, "So I looked over your application. Your GPA is excellent." And he said, "You're one of the few people that applied that actually had experience, because I had summer breaks and quarter breaks. My wife was in nurses training. It was my girlfriend then. Was in nurses training at Lima Memorial Hospital, and I got a job in physical therapy there." He said, "You have experience in physical therapy?" He said, I've read over all the comments of the people that interviewed you. They were outstanding. And on top of that, the president of the Society of Physical Therapists for the state of Ohio has highly recommended you." He said, "I look at this and I don't understand it." And I'm thinking, well, neither do I. And so then he said, "I looked at this and I just thought, no, this isn't right. Something's got to be done." So he said he went to the physical therapy head of their program and talked to them. And they said, "You know what, it's too late. Maybe a mistake has been made, but we've already sent out all of the acceptance letters. There's nothing we can do about it now." And so he said, "I went to all the other divisions in the School of Allied Medicine and found out there was one position open in radiology that they hadn't sent out the acceptance letter yet." And he said, "I told them even though they hadn't interviewed you, they couldn't fill the position, and I was going to give it to you if you wanted." And I told them that I had already promised, I was made up my mind, I was going to give you 3 days to think about this. And naturally, he didn't know I was going to be praying about it, but he said, "I'll give you 3 days to think about it. That's what I'm told. That's what I'm telling him. So you can't fill this position." So he gave me all this information, and he said, "I don't want you to give me an answer now. I want you to just think about it and call me back in 3 days." Now, I have to tell you, it is a miracle to have the president of the School of Allied Medicine call you, because at Ohio State, in my graduating class, there was over 30,000 people, and I was always J38093. Nobody knew me by name. I was a number. It was sort of like being a prisoner or something. And for him to call me, it was amazing. So obviously, I went back to these scriptures, and I knew that God was in control. So as I prayed about it, I thought, you know what? This wasn't the path that I had set out for myself, but my path really is to follow the Lord. Obviously, the Lord has opened this door. It was a tough decision to make in some respects, because one of the courses we had to take was an allied medicine overview. And in that overview, we studied radiology and had to go take tours and stuff. And at the time, I'm thinking, wow, am I glad I'm not doing that? I don't think I would like that. And plus, I really didn't like physics, let alone radiation physics. And so here comes the Lord with this offer. I prayed about it and said, you know what? If this is the Lord's will, I'll do it. It's okay. So I went ahead and accepted the position. And when fall quarter came around then, I started the program. And we started in September. December, at the end of the quarter, I got married. Life improved. And then my second year in the radiology program at Ohio State, my wife and I felt like the Lord was speaking to us about applying for missions. And my wife had felt a call to missions. I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but in Mount Vernon, Ohio, there is a holiness camp meeting called Camp Sychar. My family and my wife's family had gone there every year for years and years. And when she was in high school, she said it was so plain that the Lord was calling her to be a nurse. And when she was still able to get out and we would go to Camp Sychar, we would never leave. I'm from a really huge family, and a bunch of my cousins, we all meet at Camp Sychar, and we'll spend 3 or 4 days there. And we would never leave Camp Sychar without Marlene going to the altar where she had committed her life to the Lord to be a nurse. And she would think about what all the Lord had done for her because she was obedient to him. So we applied for missions, and that was a 3-year process. I graduated. We both went back to Northwest Ohio, got jobs, and continued the application process. And we got word that they wanted us to come out for interviews. We went out for the interviews, and they said, well, because you've never been to a Christian college, even though you're Christians and you both have been raised in the church, we want to know if you would be willing to quit your jobs and move to Kansas City and go to seminary with no promise that you will be appointed to be missionaries. And it was, again, a bit of a difficult position. And yet, we could look and see how the Lord had step-by-step had prepared everything, because my wife is extremely intelligent, and besides working in neurointensive care and cardiac intensive care, when we had gone back, she became the private scrub nurse of a neurosurgeon. And this man told her she was the best nurse he had ever had. And when they would have really difficult cases that may last 12 or 14 hours, he would say to her, I'm sorry, I know I was grouchy. It's not aimed at you. I just get tense. And so I don't want you to leave me. Here's $3,000. And that happened a number of times. And because he did that, we were able to use that money and pay off all of my school loans, because I had school loans even though I worked full-time. I didn't make enough to pay those. We made enough money. We paid off our school loans. And we went ahead and went to Kansas City and started seminary. They continued to give us more interviews, and then we found out that we were appointed. And they said that it was a miracle because there was a hospital in Manzini, Swaziland, where they needed a radiographer. They had no one at all in the hospital, and they needed a nurse that had experience in cardiology, neurology, and surgery. And so by appointing the Jeromes, they could fill both positions and pay one salary. And the salary was not a lot. It was $172 a month, and we got a place to live. But we were in the Lord's will. It was okay. And so they, after we were appointed, we finished the semester that we were in seminary, and they told us we had to leave immediately. They had a dedication service where they dedicated all the people that they had appointed at that time. And at the end of the dedication service, my mom and dad and my aunt and uncle came to be at the dedication service with us. We were going down from the dedication service to the basement to have some refreshments, and there was down this wide set of steps. I remember it vividly. And as Marlene and I were in front of my mom and dad and my aunt and uncle, and there was a lady walking beside my mom, and she said to my mother, "I just want you to know that I'm committing to pray for Dave and Marlene for the whole 4 years they're gone. But I want you to know I will also pray for you, because I know it has to be tough for you having your kids go to Africa and you won't see them for 4 years, and you will have concerns for them." And my mom said to the lady, she said, "Thank you, I really appreciate that. It means a lot to me, but I have to tell you, the Lord has prepared me for this for 20 years, and I see that this is the answer that God had told us would happen." And I'm looking at my mom, and I'm thinking, what in the world is she talking about? And so when we got our food and got to the table, I sat next to my mom, and I said, "Okay, what did you mean when you were telling that lady you had prepared for this for 20 years? Marlene and I applied 3 years ago. You didn't know about this." And she said, "Actually, I did." She said, "When you were 5 years old, your grandmother called me over to her house and said she needed to talk to me." My grandmother that she was talking about was my dad's mom, but my dad's mom and my mom, you would have thought that they were mother and daughter. They were such prayer warriors. They got along like everybody would dream you get along with your mother-in-law. And my mom said that she went there, and my grandmother told her that the night before when she was praying, the Lord told her that she needed to pray and fast, that I would give my heart to Jesus Christ, and that if I did that, he was going to call me to be a missionary at some point in my life. And so my grandmother told my mom, she said, "What I think that we need to do is, because God has asked us to be faithful and fast in prayer, I'm asking you to pray with me." And she said, "We don't have to be together, but every Wednesday at noontime, we will fast and pray that David will give his heart to the Lord, and that David will follow whatever the direction of the Lord is. And if the Lord wants him to be a missionary, he will be obedient to the Lord." And she said, "The other caveat to this is you must never say anything to anyone about this." She said, "We want David to know that God has called him, and that God will see him through these things, and he cannot become a missionary because his mom and his grandma want him to. So we both have to say, we will not discuss this with anyone." And I was just appalled. For 20 years, they had fasted and prayed every Wednesday. And so as I was thinking about this, I said, it all makes sense, because I'm from a poor family, and all the way through high school, when I had papers due, I would go to my cousin's house. She had a really nice brand new typewriter, and she was my age, and so whenever I had reports, I would just go to my cousin's and type them on her typewriter and hand them in. When I got ready to go to Ohio State, I told my mom, I said, you remember, my grandma called me over to her house just before I was ready to leave and said she needed to talk to me. I went there, and she said, "Come on in the dining room. I need to talk to you." So I go into the dining room, and there's an Adler typewriter in a gray case that is identical to my cousin's. So I'm going, "Is Deb here?" And my grandma says, "No, why?" And I said, "Well, her typewriter's here, and you can't type." And my grandma says, "Look a little closer at that typewriter." So I went over and looked at it, and down by the handle was a little silver plate that said, "J. David Jerome, 318 Middle Street, Van Wert, Ohio." And she said, "Open that up." And I opened it, and on top of the typewriter was another little silver plate. I have a cousin that is a jeweler, and she had him put that on there. And I'm going, Grandma, how could you do this? My grandmother was financially worse off than my parents. And she said, God provided it. It's a miracle. And so I took her at her word. And so when my mom told me about my grandmother and her fasting and praying for 20 years, I asked her, I said, so do you happen to know the idea or how Grandma had money to buy that typewriter for me? And my mom said, I don't know anything about it. But my aunt says, David, I know that. And I said, so what's that story? And she said, I went over to my mom's house. My aunt was my grandmother's daughter. She said, I went over to my mom's house to see her, and it just happened that the day I went to see her, she got a letter from you that was in college, while you were in college, and it was typed on your typewriter. And she said, Mom said, look at this letter I got from David. It's so nice. She said, it's nice to see he's using the typewriter. And my aunt said to her mom, she said, Mom, I think that's good too, but I have to ask you a question. How did you ever have money to buy David a typewriter? And my grandma just said, well, God provided it. I told that to David, and God did provide it. And she said, yes, Mom, but how did God provide it? And she said, well, I will tell you. She said, I knew where Deb's dad got her typewriter, and it was at a little bookstore in Van Wert. She said, I called them up and asked them how much that typewriter cost, and they told me, and I thanked them, and I prayed about it, and I sat down and looked at my finances, and I realized that if I went without my heart medicine for 6 months, I could buy David that typewriter. And I'm going, what? And yet, my grandmother had prayed for 20 years that I would give my heart to the Lord, which I did at 8, and then she prayed that I would become a missionary. She was determined that she would do everything in her power to see that I had every ability to fulfill the Lord's will. Otherwise, I would have gone to OSU without a typewriter. I don't know what I would have done. But still, you see the commitment of my grandmother. And she was like this with other people too. And as we think about that, I want you to also think about last Sunday morning, Easter Sunday morning. Do you remember this whole front row of the choir was filled with kids? What do you think, how could the Lord use those kids' lives if we committed to pray and fast for them? I learned a long time ago. I could tell you so many stories of miracles that have happened. You don't need to know people's names. It's nice to recognize their face or something, but God knows who's on your heart. You can pray for those kids that were in that row, that they will give their heart and life to the Lord, and that God will use them and direct their paths. We have no idea of what God could use and accomplish through their lives if we do our part and pray and fast for them. And I'm nobody special. This is my testimony, but I'm just a layman like you. God has a plan for all of us. None of our plans are any better than another. And my grandmother prayed for many people like she prayed for me. So consequently, we left. We went to Swaziland, and we got to Swaziland. I actually had to look this place up on the map. I had no idea where it was. And we got to Swaziland on a late Sunday afternoon. Normally, for most missionaries, when you go to a mission field, they give you 1 year to learn the language, and then you start your assignment. But because there was no radiographers in the hospital and there was no nurses that had the abilities that my wife, or the knowledge that my wife did, she used to go into surgeries, and we had general surgeons who had never done like burr holes in people's skulls for brain bleeds and things, and she would go into surgery and tell these docs what to do. So we got to Swaziland Sunday afternoon, 7 o'clock Monday morning. We're in the hospital doing our job, and that God has called us to do. But let me tell you, it's not easy. in high school, I took French. And, you know, when you learn a foreign language, it's not a big deal. You memorize the words, you learn the sentence structure. And especially for like European languages, the sounds are pretty similar to us. African languages, nothing similar. They had people to assist me in radiology that could speak English, and I would ask them how to say something in Siswati so that I could take care of patients. And they would tell me, but I couldn't always hear any difference at all. And they would always say, well, they'll know what you mean. And the problem with an African language is, I can give you some examples. It's been 30 years since I've spoken, so I've forgotten what little I knew maybe. But TH, like in the, TH is, and C, Q, and X are not pronounced other than clicks. C is, X is, and Q is. So if I'm, let's say, just so you get a little bit of a taste of it, if I'm going to say, hello, how are you? It's warm. I'd say, Selbona wena wem slanga. Ninjani nia ku nia. I can't even do it. My mouth is sore now. I'm talking so much. Nia ku ka. How do you distinguish between these clicks? You know, it's so hard. And I realized that patients would look at me, and especially the older people, and they would hesitate. They wouldn't know what to do. And I realized that they were going, what is this white guy saying? They had also assigned us to work in a church. And the church that they had assigned us to work in was, fortunately for us, it was the only English-speaking church that was connected. All of the other churches, there was like 50 or 60 other churches, but they were all Siswati-speaking churches. And in southern Africa, centuries ago, you all read about the Dutch East Indies and things in school. When sailors went to southern Africa, there weren't enough European women, and eventually they settled there and they began marrying African women. And over the centuries, a whole separate race of what we would call biracial people formed. And in southern Africa, there's hundreds of thousands of these people. And they look very similar to like Vanessa Williams or something. One child may have blonde hair and blue eyes, and the next one has an olive complexion and green eyes and dark wavy hair. You just never, they used to tease Marlene, my wife, when she was pregnant, and they would say, well, at least you know what your baby's going to look like. It was very different because, you know, when everybody immigrated to the United States, people learned to speak English. But in Africa, they didn't do that. The English, the Dutch, the German, the French, and there was also Indians from India, and then the Africans. They mixed the 4 European languages and made one language, and they call it Afrikaans. Well, most of the biracial people speak Afrikaans in their homes to each other, and their education is in Afrikaans. It's really, I think, from my point of view, it's a lot more German and Dutch than it is French or English. If I'm going to say hello to you, I would say, Middag meneer, hoe gaan het? And yet, some of those people migrated to Swaziland, where we lived, and there was enough of them that they formed an English-speaking church. We didn't have a building or anything. We worshipped in a school, and Marlene and I had children's church in our home on Wednesday nights. But those people spoke Afrikaans, but they were also fluent in English. And one of the guys from church, I talked to him, and I said, you know, I'm having a terrible time with this Siswati business. I know I'm saying stuff wrong, and I need help, but the Swazi people are so polite, they won't tell me when I make a mistake. In African culture, you always have somebody above you. If you're a child, it's every kid that's older than you, your mother, your father, your uncles, your grandparents, and any adult can discipline any kid. It's all right. A wife is always responsible to her husband, and then small communities have what's called an nduna that controls everything. If people get to fighting amongst themselves, they have to go to the nduna. He settles things. Above him is a king, or above him is a chief, and then it goes right on up the line to the king. And so with me being the only radiographer in the hospital and people working with me, they looked at me as a person in charge, and because they were so polite, they wouldn't tell me the horrible mistakes I was making. So I explained this to this guy from our church that had immigrated years before that, and he said, you know what, my 8-year-old son is very fluent in Siswati. He plays with the African kids all the time, and in Africa, all the kids get out of school at noon because it's so hot. And so he said, I'll just ask him if he wants to come to work with you in the hospital every day. And I know he's going to say yes because he loves you. And so I said, that would be great. And he says, I have to warn you, he's ornery. He will laugh at you. He will make fun of you. He will belittle you. And I said, that's all right. I think it's easier to learn a language like this from a kid because they will laugh at you and they will tell you the truth. So he came, and he did. He helped me learn to speak Siswati. I was very good with medical things and everything I needed to communicate to my patients. But because we went to an English-speaking church and our friends spoke Afrikaans in their homes, I picked up a lot more comfortable conversation with Afrikaans than I did Siswati. And so in a church, I sometimes, if it was a Swazi church, was counting the bricks on the wall or something, truthfully. But Bradley taught me to speak Siswati. And fast forwarding 8 years, we were at church one Sunday night, and my wife and I finished our responsibilities with our part of the service, turned it over to the pastor to preach, and an ambulance showed up. Back then, there was no calls, no phones, no pagers, nothing like that. And so anytime we went someplace, I worked 6 days a week in the hospital from 7 till 5:30. Then from 5:30 till 7 the next morning, I was on call for everybody that came into the hospital that needed x-rays. And the ambulance driver shows up, and he says, lets me know I need to go to the hospital immediately. And he said, you're supposed to bring your wife. And I'm going, why my wife? She doesn't know anything about x-ray, and she's not on call. And he goes, Angati, I don't know. Don't ask me. And so we went, and when we got to the hospital, the surgeon came out, and Bradley's parents were already there, the little boy that had taught me to speak Siswati, who was 16 now. And they said that he had gone to a soccer game on Sunday afternoon. When the soccer game was over, he was walking down the dirt road to go back home, and a drunk man in a pickup truck ran over him and drug him on a dirt road. And he had all these abrasions and everything, and they said one leg is totally destroyed, and they said it needs to come off, but we have a major problem. And I have to tell you, I think Bradley's about to die. And I'm going, what's wrong? Why aren't you doing the surgery? He said, well, Bradley lost so much blood that if I try to do surgery, it will kill him. But if I don't remove that leg, he's going to suffer and die in just a short time. And he said, I don't know what to do. There was 4 other hospitals in the country. He said, we contacted every hospital. We contacted the government. There is no blood, his blood type. And I said, I don't understand this. Why not? And the surgeon told me, he said, well, Bradley's colored, and I didn't mean to use that. I know it's a term people in America find offensive. They refer to themselves as colored. If you would say something about them being biracial, they would go, what is that? We're colored. So that slips out. They said Bradley, because of his genetics, happens to have a negative blood type, and only 1% or less than 1% of the people in Swaziland are biracial, and so there is almost no negative blood types anywhere. And they said, we even went down, there was a big Swazi church on our mission compound where They usually ran 1,000 people. And they even interrupted the service and said, there are the people here that know their blood type, because most people wouldn't. But the people here that know their blood type, do you have this type of blood? And they didn't have it. So he said, we don't know what to do. Because I know for a fact if I take him to surgery, I will kill him. And he said, then to make matters worse, if you're in any other European country, only 7% of the people in the whole world have a negative blood, or have his blood type. He didn't tell me the type yet. He said only 7% of the people in the whole world have this blood type. And he said, so even finding it in Africa, anywhere, is going to be difficult. So I said, what blood type is he? And the surgeon said, he's A negative. And I looked at my wife, and we both held out our hands. 7% of the people in the world are A negative. And I married someone with A negative blood. Going back to this scripture, I have the plans prepared for you. Do you think that any of this is a coincidence? That God would ask my grandmother to pray that I would yield my heart to him? That I would open my heart to follow him, to be a missionary? That my wife would even date me? I'm from the other side of the tracks, and my wife's family wasn't. My father-in-law highly despised me. 6 months before he died, he apologized. He even kicked my wife out of the house at one point. And so he was never happy with this situation. And Marlene, of all things, I asked Marlene out for our first date when I was 15 for my birthday. Marlene was a year ahead of me in school. She was dating this starter on the basketball team. I literally can't walk and chew gum at the same time. And so the likelihood of us ever getting together was like pretty negligible. But yet she consented to go out with me for my 15th birthday, and it went on from there. We got married. God called us both to Swaziland. God prepared us in the education areas that we need. Do you see the master architect? Do you see the painter in this? And so the surgeon told us, he said, you know what? Normally we take 1 pint of blood, but we can take 2. If you both will be willing to let us take 2 pints of blood from you, the 4 pints will get Bradley through the surgery. And I'm bawling at this point. And sometimes I say my bladder moves up to my eyes. It's embarrassing when you're a guy, when you get too teary-eyed. But anyhow, they took 2 pints of blood from both Marlene and I. They did Bradley's surgery. They came out later and said he got along absolutely great. Everything went well. But we have to tell you this. We're going to let him recoup for about 18 hours, and then we're going to take him back to surgery. Because we removed the leg, we made a flap and covered everything up. But where he was drugged down that dirt road, there's gravel, there's dirt, there's all kinds of things in there. And if we had kept him under anesthesia longer, it was too hard on his organs and his body. He would have gone into organ failure. So we're going to let him get some rest, and we'll take him back to surgery late tomorrow afternoon. So we said, okay. Tomorrow afternoon comes. They take him back to surgery late in the afternoon, and the doc doesn't come out, and he doesn't come out, and he doesn't come out. And, of course, his parents aren't real concerned about this. They don't know what to think, but I am very concerned. And when he comes out, he said, I have some very difficult news for you. He said, they call it debridement when they clean all of that out. We did the debridement and got along fine, but in recovery, Bradley died. And he said, it was so hard, I couldn't, because this surgeon actually went to the same church we did. And he said, I just had to collect my thoughts, and I sat down at the desk and just was doing charting and thinking and trying to think if I could have done anything different. He said, we did CPR, we tried everything to bring him back, and he didn't. But he said, after being pronounced dead, 30 minutes later, a nurse started screaming and yelling for us because he was having these involuntary muscle movements underneath the sheet they had him covered with. And he said, I went and examined him, and he's comatose. His brain isn't functioning. His brain went without oxygen for over 30 minutes. And so the medulla, the bottom part of your brain that controls your heart and your breathing, is technically dead. And sometimes when you're young and you're muscular and real healthy, your heart will just start beating, but because it gets no signal from the brain, eventually it stops and he will die again. And they said if it goes on and beats for some time, then he will still stay in a vegetative state because his brain is dead, and he'll ultimately get pneumonia. And because he's immobile, it will kill him. So ultimately, your son is going to die. We just don't know when. My heart was broken. His dad and mom decided that the best thing they could do was go home to their 4 other children and try to go through all of this, because I had said I wanted to stay with Bradley. And they were comfortable with that. So they went home to be with their family. And in this hospital, it's nothing like you can imagine. We just had big open wards. We had ceilings that were falling in, and cats, feral cats running around in the hospital because rats and mice and snakes and bats. And they didn't really have rooms to put patients in, but again, culturally there is a problem, because the people that are pure Africans don't like the biracial people. They call them nomtombiles, meaning they have half a white brain and half a black brain, and they can't work together. And so if we put Bradley on that open ward with all he was going through, he would just be, everybody would be staring and talking and things like that. I asked him to find a room for him. We found a room, and I sat beside him all night long and literally cried and prayed. And just about 6:30 in the morning, the sun was coming up to my back through a window, and he started with all these involuntary muscle movements again. And a lot of times people can do that when they're about to pass. And we didn't have beds like you have in a hospital here. They were more like you would envision maybe a prison bed. It's just a metal frame with springs across it and a little thin, dirty mattress over it. And so I got up and I put my hands on his shoulders like this to hold him down, because I was afraid he was going to fall out. And with this big open wound, it would only make things worse if he fell on the concrete floor. And I did that. I didn't know what to do. And as I was holding him down, and again, he's a 16-year-old, very muscular soccer player. All of a sudden, he got his arms between my arms that were pushing on his shoulders, and he flipped my arms away, and he sat up in bed, and he said, "Dad, quit pushing on me. I have to use the bathroom." Well, you know what? Bradley is married. He has kids. He moved to South Africa. He runs a car repair shop. And the crazy guy even rides motorcycles with one prosthetic leg. But none of this, absolutely none of this was a surprise to God. He knew these things would happen. He did not cause them to happen. But you look at this scripture where it says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God has prepared ahead of time that we should walk on them." I'm asking, and again, I'm a layman. I'm talking to myself as well as you. What has God prepared for you? My life is no different than yours. You know, when the Swazi government came in and said that all the missionaries needed to leave and go home, that the government was going to take over the hospital, it didn't change anything for me. My mission assignment changed, but my missionary status didn't. Our pastor, we're lucky. We have a great pastor, and he preaches the word to us. And what he does, he prepares us, he builds a foundation for us to build our spiritual life on. But our testimonies as laymen can impact people that he will never have a chance to talk to. You know, I didn't even intend to come to Columbus. I'm a country bumpkin. And like I said, I have probably between 100 and 175 cousins and distant cousins, and we get together every Thanksgiving, and we have a reunion every year. We are so close. We were like a pack of dogs running in school. Every teacher we were their nightmare, I'm sure. I was looking forward to going back to Northwest Ohio and settling, and Columbus was the last thing on my mind, and I got a phone call from Mount Carmel West saying, we heard that you're back from Africa, and we have a position for a radiology manager. We want to know if you would come interview. Again, God is opening this door. It's not the door that I assumed I would go through, but my mission field changed, and my responsibility then became working with patients, praying with patients, and I had almost 100 staff that knew that we met for prayer regularly. We didn't care whether you were Nazarene, Free Will Baptist, Catholic, Pentecostal. We had Mennonites. People would meet in my office, and we would pray. We were brothers and sisters in the Lord, and there were people that worked with us that accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, not because I preached a sermon, but because I could give my testimony. My sermon was my life, the way I acted. Where you live, if you live in a house, if you live in an apartment, if you live in a senior citizens building, God has you there for a purpose. It's not to be idle. I have an aunt that's 92 years old. She hasn't been able to get out to go to church for years. She's blind and has health problems. Yet she's our family prayer warrior. Like I said, there can be 175 of us. And every day, 2 to 3 times a day, she prays for every person by name. When we have a prayer request, I will call her and update her on my wife's conditions, and she'll even have her daughter get her a card and write. Her daughter will dictate what she's supposed to say to Marlene to encourage her. God has a ministry for everyone. My wife's grandfather went to a nursing home before he died. He had the nurses tell him when patients were about to die, and he would sit at their bedside and give them teaspoons of water. And when we went and talked to him, he sobbed, and he said, "It's pathetic. You got all these old people in the nursing home that are going to hell. They have never given their life to the Lord." And so he said, my ministry is to sit with these people and share the plan of salvation and pray that they will accept Christ before they die. There is no time in our life that God has put us on a back burner. Right now, I don't get to come to church other than Sunday mornings because I need to help my wife a lot. But you know what? I am so blessed. I have 50 plus years of working in the hospital. I can handle the situations that my wife needs. And when she goes to a doctor, I go in and part of that conversation, sometimes I think she'd be happy if I wasn't. But God prepares us for everything in our life. My question is, does everybody here see that master designer? Do you see that painter? Do you see that architect that's in your life? Are you allowing him? Our painting is never complete. The building is never complete. There's always additions that need to be done. I want to encourage you to allow him to work completely and fully in your life. And I'm talking to myself. I'm not lecturing you. Trust me. But God has given us the Great Commission. And when we read over that Great Commission, it doesn't say, "Go ye pastors into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." It doesn't say that. It says, "Go ye." When he says ye, he's talking to every single Christian. When I was in college, they used to have these posters that said, "Bloom where you're planted." That's true. He expects us to bloom where he plants us. And yet we are so fortunate as Americans because we can literally do every part of fulfilling that directive to go ye into all the world. We can support through our church, we can support international meetings, our international missions, or missionaries that we hear on the radio. Here at this church, we also have the opportunity to support local missions. We're having a missionary speaker here in a couple weeks. We can support her, but we can also support this church, and we can support the youth of this church. And it's not just the young youth. You look at his grandson. His grandson now needs so much prayer because God is preparing him to be a minister, but there may be a woman in his life that he will meet. And that person, a wife, our pastor's lucky. He's got a gym. She's so good, and she is an amazing piano player even. But Landon needs a helpmate at some point, possibly, that will be an asset to his ministry, because if you don't have a wife that's called to be married to a pastor, she can ruin a pastor's ministry. Every single person in this church needs help, and God uses us in little ways and in big ways. You know, one time I was at Walmart shopping, and I saw this short lady struggling to get a watermelon out of a deep, tall cardboard box, and I was like 15 to 20 foot away. And so I'm thinking, oh, this is no big deal. I'll go help her. So I go over to this lady and I said, "Can I help you get this watermelon?" And she says, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, show me the one you want." I pick it up and I put it in her cart. And then I go back and I get the rest of my groceries. That's on a Friday. On Sunday, I'm sitting in church and I really don't know a whole lot of people. I realize someone sits down behind me, and pretty soon somebody taps me on the shoulder. It's Meshach. And I turn around and I see him, but then I see the little woman that needed the help with the watermelon. And do you think that was a coincidence? I mean, since that time, they've come to visit my wife and encourage her, send her cards. Everything we do, there are not coincidences or not things like that. My kids always call them God instances. Everything we do, God has a plan, and he doesn't say, "I'll be walking with you some of the time. I have plans for you some of the time." He has plans all of the time, and I just want to encourage you to look for that master painter, look for that master architect in your life, and allow him the privilege of using you. You will be so blessed. I couldn't begin. When I gave my heart to the Lord at 8, and when I went to missions, I had no idea. When I went to Mount Carmel, I had no idea how God would use me. But I am nobody in particular. You can ask my wife. She can confirm that. Does anyone have any questions or anything? Pastor, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Challenge. This is amazing. Thank you.
I've got bad knees. Sorry.